As aviation started getting bigger and better, of course, the call was for Santa Barbara to have an airport. And so where to put the airport? Well, there was a group of people that wanted to put an airport on the mesa where Shoreline Park is. It was a guy named Captain Lowe, that was his property. And so there's a great call to have a mesa airport. And right after that happened, I have a letter from a realtor offering this woman of Montecito the potential to buy this property on before the oil people come, because there is also oil being discovered on the mesa. And they said, well, before the oil guys get these towers up here, you better buy this property just in time for an airfield. And there were several other people that started calling for an airport on the mesa, that a Ford Trimotor could land there. So this is like 1928. And what I find humorous about this story was, first, this thing was spread where a leading citizen said we should have an airfield because it's going to be a major improvement for the city, and the mesa is just the proper place to put it. Then we have the realtors all of a sudden moving, trying to sell this property to speculators. And then I found an ad 4 days later, which was for insurance against falling aircraft parts on your house should it be near an airfield.
While many of Santa Barbara's early airfields began on ranches and farms, some aviators took a more impromptu approach to testing their aircraft designs.
Well, he says, we're getting ready to fly this thing. He says, if you're interested, he says, be there at 6 o'clock in the morning on De La Guerra Street in Milpas. And he says, there's a little hill there, and the road goes down De La Guerra Street down between the dump lots. And he says, we're going to try to fly it there. So I showed up at 6 o'clock, and they were fluttering around this thing, putting gas in it and making sure it run and all stuff. It only had a little small little engine in it, and that was the reason they needed the hill to get it going. See? So they started this thing up and said, okay, stand back now, and they give it a push over the top of the hill. Got it going pretty good, and the darn thing took off. And it was only probably 4 or 5 feet off the ground, but it was flat.
There was another airfield just off of Milpas Street behind the Marmonte Hotel, and some call it the Corona del Mar Airport. And there was a Zenith Aircraft Company that was building airplanes out there. And so that was their landing field, and I think 1 or 2 crashes may have happened, and so that's why that airfield sort of closed up and went down.
One of the fields that was developing early was in Santa Barbara, and 3 local flyers were not real pleased with that location, and so they got the rights to develop a field here in Goleta, basically southwest of the intersection of Fairview and Hollister Avenues.
It was a deep sea sailing port, and that was in the 1800s, 1860. And Goleta was slated to be the capital of California for a short time because they had the deepwater sailing port. And they had timber here to build ships. So all of that looked real good for Goleta. But in 1862, they had 1 month of constant rain, and the whole mountain slid down right over everything, wiped out most of Goleta, and filled up the deepwater sailing port with dirt, which made enough of a runway to fly the very first airplanes off of it.
At that time, Goleta was a very small community of a few hundred people. Most of the land was devoted to farms and ranches.
Airport was kind of a country airport, and there's no tower, no nothing, no electronics. Heck, there's only 1 in 5 airplanes out there that had a battery or lights or anything. It was really kind of Model T Ford days for those airplanes in those days.
The Goleta Field, sometimes referred as the Goleta Airport, sometimes as the Santa Barbara Airport, was primarily in use as a dairy farm. This presented its own set of challenges to early aviators.
The airport operator says, well, you land on the lawn, but you have to scare the cows away first before you can land, because that was a milk farm where the tower is.
The Goleta Field and the Ovington Field were early competitors, and the Santa Barbara City Council passed an ordinance that basically shut down the Ovington Field because of the air traffic too near residential areas. Century Pacific was the first commercial airline to come in. That was in, I believe, 1931. They had service to the Bay Area, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Tucson.
The next major tenant at the new airport was the General Western Aero Corporation. Their airplane design was the first to use a metal propeller.
This is a company that began in Burbank in 1930. They liked the Goleta, Santa Barbara area. There was this new field in Goleta that had just been started in 1928-29. They built a number of buildings here in Goleta, most significantly 2 hangars, which survive today. They had several planes that they advertised. Only one really was built in any kind of a quantity, and that was the Meteor, which was a single engine, single wing, 2-seat sport plane, basically. Now remember, this is right after the start of the Depression, and so money was very tight, and people were worrying about a lot more things besides, sport aviation, unfortunately for General Western. So as it turned out, they only ended up making just a handful of payments on their lease, maybe 4, 5, 6 months, and they were basically out of money. All of the buildings right there were taken, the General Western buildings were taken over by the Bundys, Burton and Jesse Bundy, who started their Santa Barbara flying service, and they were doing repair, they were doing flight school, and they lived upstairs in the administration building, which was located in between the 2 hangars, and they were there for a number of years.
I remember going out there and watching the DC-3 come in and landing on a dirt field. And if you're familiar with the airport, on the northeast corner, there are 2 hangars, and in between those 2 hangars was a little tiny shop. You'd think it was a tool shop or something. That was the first office for United Airlines in Santa Barbara, yeah.
Well, United Airlines, and it's kind of its former self, started service at the Santa Barbara Airport, actually before it was the Santa Barbara Airport, in 1936.
This was the big air carrier in the United States, handling about 35% of all of the passenger air travel domestic in the U.S. and about 40% of all of the airmail. They used the hangars. The administration building became their passenger terminal. There wasn't a control tower on there at the field, and so they added a little control tower on the top of one of the 2 hangars, spotting tower, I guess it would have been.
Pretty soon, passenger air travel really caught on, and United approached the city about building a terminal at another location on the airport. And the city entered into a lease with them, and United contracted with the architects Edwards and Plunkett, and they designed a small Spanish colonial revival building that was the original terminal, and then of course over the years it was added on to. Finally, in 1941, there was a bond issue presented to the voters, and they passed it to buy the property that was the original part of the airport. And then, of course, simultaneously, the U.S. entered into World War II, and they were looking for bases on the coasts.
Right after Pearl Harbor, basically Goleta was identified as, a good location for a Marine base, and that started that entire development. And it basically took over the, essentially all of the airport operation, buildings on where UCSB is now, additional, lots of buildings on the north side of Hollister, and of course, quite a bit on the airport property as well.
Because they wanted to have a Corsair facility for training in Corsairs. Corsair was a fairly fast airplane, a big airplane and so forth, so they needed, but it required a pretty long runway.
With the creation of the Marine base, suddenly we've got a much greater demand for flying and especially for landing. And so the airport was dramatically increased in size at that point. One of the very unfortunate results of that was removal of a huge portion of the Chumash Indian village on Mescaleton Island.
Phil Orr, who was our curator of anthropology here at the museum, went out and did archaeological excavations. And we can tell from the work that he did back in the 1940s that the town was occupied as early as 2,000 years ago. There were actually 4 Chumash towns around the Goleta Lagoon, one of which was on the island, Mescaleton Island. And the name of that town, by the way, was Helo. There was another name also that was recorded for the island called Hua, and that name actually appears in Cabrillo's account in 1542. So Cabrillo had been given that name and several other names around the Goleta Valley back in 1542. Apparently the towns had different names, several centuries before the first Spanish land expedition arrived. Really, if you look at the population along the Santa Barbara Channel, all the way from Point Conception, down to Ventura, and then you look at the population on the Channel Islands and the Santa Ynez Valley, one of the most central places is the Goleta Valley. So, trade routes and trade had to funnel through that area. And so the Goleta towns were really optimally situated to participate in this regional trade system. There have been several different archaeological projects since that have resulted in further investigations on the island. Really, those collections that have come from those excavations have informed us about changes through time in Chumash culture. And in particular, the beads and ornaments, that have been found during the different excavations have been useful to work out the whole sequence of change. And so when you study the changes in beads and ornaments, you're also studying the changes in the political economy of Chumash society. So the Mescaleton Islands has played a big role in understanding these changes.